In my opinion, you're the great debunker. What I'm hoping in this conversation is to go into what we definitely know about Epstein, then look at some of these conspiracies.
It's very peculiar. I'll just describe the whole chronology here. The first, I would say, was probably 2011. So that's when Virginia Giuffre first gives an interview to the Daily Mail, and she's paid $160,000 for it. Why should we, the general public, regard this person as at all credible, given her demonstrable record of chronic fabrications? And I think people need to be clear, like, what the facts are.
Have any of her claims been corroborated by others?
So, we know, we don't have to speculate. The most explosive files, almost certainly, are in the possession of... He has 15 plus hours of interview footage that he conducted with Epstein in 2018 or 2019.
We have to talk about the Maxwell family.
Maxwell says that her father never met Epstein. It's just like a bunch of random facts without much basis at all. Not saying every victim is totally lacking in credibility, but the most prominent ones tend to be severely lacking in credibility.
Wait, you're suggesting the Netflix special was...
Filthy rich? Horrible. One of the theories that have been percolating is that Epstein supposedly wired all his houses. She's trying to tell this New York Post journalist that she has these sex tapes. What happens? She admits she made the whole thing up. On this Netflix documentary, she's just an unsullied survivor with utmost credibility. It's a deception and a fraud on the audience.
There's so much that it's so hard to access. Oh, it's an Israeli Mossad, it's the evil Jews, or whatever it is.
I just think that the supposed mystery that people want to insist must exist is based on confirmation bias. Like, people want to believe that there's this huge mystery, right?
Michael Tracey, a great pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time to come and speak with me. You've been all over the place, and we've seen your viral press conference in DC, or rather you're attending a press conference hosted by the Congressman Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna regarding the Epstein, or the new Epstein Files Act, I think it's what it's called. And you have...
Files Transparency Act, I think, is the official name. Not that it matters much.
I think well, okay. So we're going to...
It achieves the opposite, but we can get into it.
It achieves the opposite.
Pretty much.
Well, we're definitely going to get into that. And you have been, as well as being a prolific journalist anyway, you have been covering this story in great detail. And I think, in my opinion, you're the great debunker.
Oh.
It seems that in a cloud and sort of endless conspiracies around the Epstein story, I find it generally quite hard to make sense of everything that's going on. And you haven't fallen prey, as far as I can tell, to a lot of the popular conspiracies. On the contrary, you've been calling them out as the nonsense they are. So what I'm hoping in this conversation is to go into what we definitely know about Epstein as what is true, then look at some of these conspiracies, and then look at the provenance and how these conspiracies have developed over the years.
Excellent.
It's quite a big...
I didn't set out to become the great debunker, but, duty calls, and here I am.
So frustrating as this might be, because I know you've done a few podcasts, can we do Jeffrey Epstein, the Michael Tracey bio, but what we definitely know is true?
Okay. Yeah. So what we definitely know is true can be ascertained by examining what Epstein himself pleaded guilty to, and therefore effectively acknowledged when he pleaded guilty in Florida, pursuant to the requirements of a non-prosecution agreement that the federal prosecutors compelled him to accede to in Florida. So in other words, starting in 2005, he was being locally prosecuted in Palm Beach County, Florida, for offenses involving his procurement of teenage girls, some of whom were above the legal age of consent in Florida, some of whom were not. And, the legal age of consent, unfortunately, is a relevant factor here, even though I joke, I'm not ordinarily that inclined to study the deep intricacies of age of consent laws, just like for my own personal gratification or anything. But, it is a relevant factor because, in England, it's 16, correct? In Florida, it's the highest pretty much anywhere in the world, which is 18. So anyway, we can bracket that. But he ends up pleading guilty to 2 state-level offenses in Florida at the compulsion of the federal prosecutors. One of those charges is felony solicitation of prostitution, which generally would refer to adults. And then at the behest of the federal prosecutors, there was a second state-level charge in Florida that he was obliged to plead guilty to. And this is kind of an unusual, convoluted arrangement as well, given the different sort of layers of government. But that second charge was procuring person under 18 for prostitution. So that's an admission by Epstein, given that he did ultimately plead guilty to it, despite his very powerful and influential defense counsel attempting stridently to convince the federal government to withdraw from the matter so that he would not have to plead guilty to the second charge at the Fed's behest. But they failed. He had to plead guilty to that second charge. And in so doing, he admitted that he engaged in unlawful sexual activity with someone who was not of legal age. And if you go look at the transcripts from when he entered his guilty plea in June of 2008, it's extremely likely. And I say extremely likely and as opposed to certain, because the names are still redacted, even in the materials that have been released under a variety of measures or through a variety of vehicles. But it's almost certain that the person to whom he pleaded guilty to procuring as a minor for prostitution was a person who, at the time that she was just before that she turned 18, she says she told a police investigator, Joe Ricari, in Palm Beach, that she had intercourse with Epstein literally the day before her 18th birthday. The police investigator asked her, was it consensual? She said yes. I'm not weighing in on whether consent can be credibly obtained from somebody of that age. I'm just reporting to you what she told the police interviewer. And then she also testified to the Palm Beach County grand jury, something to this effect as well. Now, there were other purported victims that the federal government had claimed that it had identified in relation to this phase of Epstein's saga. So in the early 2000s, around 2002, 2005, some of whom were not of legal age, but had not been formally adjudicated as victims. But pursuant to the non-prosecution agreement, Epstein also agreed to a mechanism whereby he would pay civil monetary damages to a certain number of government-designated victims. Again, very convoluted. It was unusual in terms of how this whole thing was brokered. And then also Epstein had to register for life as a sex offender. And then he had to serve some term of incarceration in the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office custody.
What's a government-designated victim?
Well, that's my term. That's sort of my term, but it's strange because, and you know, we could get derailed in a discussion of this potentially. But in 2004, George W. Bush, who was then president, signed into law something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act. It's basically effectively a tough-on crime style bill. You know, proponents of so-called victims' rights were championing this bill, and it was claimed that, or it's since been claimed that, pursuant to that statute, the government is obliged to proactively notify potential victims, meaning victims who have not been found in any kind of adversarial process to in fact be victims, but who are motivating or catalyzing to some extent an investigation of a potential culprit. The government is supposed to have some kind of affirmative obligation to notify those victims that there could be something like a plea agreement in the works or a non-prosecution agreement in the case of Epstein. It's unclear like what obligations the government really did have at this time, but the lawyers who like glommed on afterwards in Florida, like Bradley Edwards, who was running this press conference last week in front of the Capitol, they kind of concocted sort of a theory whereby it was their allegation that the government failed to uphold that Crime Victims' Rights Act by not, they claim, adequately notifying this universe of potential victims that the government had identified without those victims having been adjudged or adjudicated as such pursuant to any kind of non-adversarial process. So when I say government-designated victims, I'm saying victims who the government essentially claims are victims, but have not been subjected to cross-examination or any kind of scrutiny that would be attendant to a full-fledged criminal trial should that come about. So that's what I mean like by government-designated victims. That's sort of my coinage.
Is that important?
Yes.
Why is that important then?
It's important as to the overall lore or mythology around the story because starting in 2008, Bradley Edwards, again, who was sort of the MC at this press conference last week, that was co-organized by Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, but they essentially deferred to Bradley Edwards.
And so what's Bradley Edwards' official role at
He's
that
a lawyer.
He's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer. He's a plaintiff's lawyer, essentially. His whole identity as a lawyer and as a public advocate is wrapped up in Epstein. It was basically Epstein's sort of arch legal nemesis for around 10 years. But that Crime Victims' Rights Act matter is highly relevant because starting just after Epstein entered his guilty plea in Florida in 2008, Edwards began to basically file motions alleging that there was some violation of that law in relation to the federal government vis-a-vis the Florida state government agreeing to that non-prosecution agreement, and also that compelled Epstein to plead guilty to those two state-level charges because the claim was, according to Edwards, that they unlawfully excluded this other range of potential victims from having input prior to the entry of the guilty plea into whether they found that to be a satisfactory outcome. But it blew up later because that litigation stretched on for years, and it culminated really in terms of the Epstein mythology, as I call it, because by 2014, Edwards filed what's called a motion for joinder just before New Year's Eve, 2014, on behalf of Virginia Giuffre. And in that motion, which Edwards filed alongside another lawyer, Paul Casello, former federal judge, they introduced on Virginia Giuffre's behalf the allegations that we now come to know as kind of the popular lore around Epstein, which is that he was running a child sex trafficking ring of some sort that was enforced by blackmail. And that's also where, by name, it is alleged that two particular individuals had committed sex crimes against Virginia Giuffre while she was a minor, Prince Andrew and Alan Dershowitz.
Okay.
And also a range of other unnamed individuals that they just kind of gesture at categorically, like foreign princes, foreign prime ministers. It was very shady legal work, frankly, and actually Edwards, after filing that motion, was sort of effectively reprimanded by the judge to whom whose court that motion was filed in, because you can't just like randomly sort of claim that there's this unspecified range of people that might have committed some crime without really substantiating it. So Edwards faced some degree of sanction for having done that, but that doesn't matter in terms of the popular lore because, what ended up becoming more than abundantly clear is that the person on whom that motion was filed, Virginia Giuffre, was just a chronic fabricator.
How so?
Well, she recanted the claims against Alan Dershowitz.
So her claims?
Her claims, yes. By 2022. So that motion was initially filed in late 2014. By 2022, November of 2022, as the culmination of a whole sort of tangled web of litigation that stemmed from that initial motion, Virginia Giuffre, through her lawyers, among whom were Bradley Edwards, who again was running this press conference last week, she had to recant her allegations against Dershowitz. And she didn't just generically allege that Alan Dershowitz had victimized her sexually, right? If you look at the deposition transcripts and you look at other places where she had made these claims, she described in lurid, graphic, grotesque detail at least 6 separate instances in which Dershowitz had sexually victimized her. Like she described his ejaculation habits, she described the specific sex acts and where they supposedly took place. And then by 2022, after nearly a decade of adamantly and vehemently insisting that this had indeed happened to her, she recants. So I'm just not sure what would be fatal to someone's credibility, if not that. But then I can also give you like dozens potentially of other examples of her incredibly deficient credibility. Her credibility was in such tatters that when Ghislaine Maxwell was tried criminally in late 2021, and she was ultimately convicted, but the government did not even call Virginia Giuffre as a witness. Because if they had, and she finally would have been subjected to bona fide cross-examination by Maxwell's defense counsel, it would have destroyed the government's whole case.
Okay, so the two most famous things about Giuffre, I think, other than what you've already outlined, to many people
Mhm.
is that photograph of her with Prince Andrew,
Yeah.
with his arm around her, and then her recent death. And there's some shadiness around the death, or rather inconsistencies in the story, which I'd like to deal with. But perhaps if you're going to make the case that she's unreliable, let's examine briefly that Prince Andrew relationship.
Well, let me just first say that I think this is especially relevant now because at this press conference last week, not to get too sidetracked into it, but one of the reasons why I asked the question that I did to Bradley Edwards, who had represented for years Virginia Giuffre as her lawyer and public advocate, was why should we, the general public, regard this person who we're told is now deceased as at all credible, given her demonstrable record of chronic fabrications? And I ended up getting thrown out of the press conference because they didn't like the content of my question. And she had been hailed over the course of that press conference and at a rally for survivors, quote unquote, that preceded the press conference as like a martyr truth teller. Like she basically was being inducted into the pantheon of American heroes. I only found this out after the fact, but once I was ejected from this press conference when Marjorie Taylor Greene was sort of riling up a mob and commanding the Capitol Police, over whom she has jurisdiction as a member of the House of Representatives, to expel me, I only saw on video afterwards that Bradley Edwards eventually did sort of on his own accord answer my question. And that's when he declared Virginia Giuffre, trying to refute me. He declared her an American hero. Okay. And she supposedly has like a new book coming out posthumously next month. So this is going to be sticking around. And I think people need to be clear, like what the facts are and why it is that her credibility is just like beyond fatally corrupted, rather than just having her mindlessly venerated and valorized as some kind of, champion of truth and justice. It's absurd. So, yeah.
Have any of her claims been corroborated by others?
Well, there is some corroboration that she was at some point in Epstein's milieu, okay? So on the Prince Andrew thing, yes, what people tend to know is that photo came out. Now, the authenticity of the photo is disputed, but we don't even have to dispute the authenticity of the photo for our purposes right now. Let's just stipulate that it's authentic, okay? That photo would have been taken in March of 2001. At that point, Virginia Giuffre was 17. So she would have been above the legal age of consent in England where the photo was taken. Now, again, I'm not that interested in having like a blowout debate over age of consent laws. I'm just saying it has to be a relevant factor. She claims that essentially that she was enslaved at the time, or she was a sex slave, so that regardless of her age, she would have been sexually victimized. She claims that she had been molested as a young child, in a way that would have been genuinely pedophilic at age 7, 8, 9, something like that, by an unnamed either family member or family associate. She then claims that she was ensnared in at least 2 other sex trafficking rings prior to even meeting Maxwell and Epstein. And then she almost certainly would have been 17 at the time that she encountered Epstein. So this would have been after August of 2001 when she turned 17. Okay. And, I think it is kind of relevant because, Ghislaine Maxwell's English. She was the, intimate associate and sort of business, not quite partner, but she ran Epstein's estates sort of as a house manager for him. And he had multiple estates: Florida, New Mexico, Virgin Islands, New York, Paris, and also actually in London, if you want to count that as one of Epstein's properties, which it, kind of de facto was, because she had that house in, oh God, what's the neighborhood of London now? I'm blanking.
He didn't own it.
Maxwell, I think it was in Maxwell's name.
Okay.
But basically Epstein was her benefactor.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the Maxwell family in a moment, but we'll stick with Giuffre.
Yeah. On Giuffre, so at the time that photo would have been taken, even if we want to just stipulate that what Giuffre claims is accurate, and my contention now is that you have to be a moron to take anything that she said at face value if there is no independent corroborating evidence. And there's no independent corroborating evidence that Prince Andrew ever committed a sex act with her or a sex crime against her. It's just her word. She does have, she produced a photo that places her potentially in the same place as Andrew. That's not dispositive proof that sex occurred, right?
Yes, but unfortunately for Prince Andrew, he also gave the most catastrophic
That is true.
interviews ever given, with famously saying he doesn't sweat and he can prove it because he was in the Falklands.
I do sweat, and I'm sweating right now. It's kind of hot in here. Not because I'm nervous.
So obviously that wasn't Prince Andrew wasn't corroborating what she said. He was refuting it, but he had such a terrible excuse for it that it fueled all the conspiracies.
Well, you know what? That interview, I think, was shamefully conducted by Emily Maitlis.
Well, that's on character.
The BBC at the time. It's like she's now made a whole living on how supposedly awesome that interview was and how it was like a triumph of journalistic acumen or interrogation or something. But if you go back and rewatch that interview, which I have recently, she's basically acting as a proxy for Bradley Edwards or for Virginia Giuffre, meaning she's credulously just reciting their claims and putting them to Andrew and requiring him to basically address their claims as though she's a lawyer, as though she's like co-counsel for Bradley Edwards or something. Meaning you would get no indication at all based on that interview that there were any credibility problems whatsoever with Virginia Giuffre, who she's basically acting as a surrogate for. And I don't think that's laudable journalism. I think it's incredibly credulous and almost sleazy journalism. And yes, Prince Andrew was sort of behaving a little bit oddly in the interview because it was not anything that anyone was accustomed to for a high senior ranking royal to sit for an adversarial interview. But just because someone comes off a bit odd doesn't mean that they're implicated in sex crimes.
I can't believe I found myself defending Emily Maitlis here with this question, because there's a few people I think of less in the British media landscape. But what exactly do you expect her to have asked, if not those most difficult accusations? How should she have conducted that?
Well, I know what I wouldn't have done. I would not have just sort of mindlessly regurgitated the fatally non-credible claims of a chronic fabricator as though I were her plaintiff's counsel, as though I was like the de facto Bradley Edwards in that situation. I wouldn't have done that.
It's because the consequence has been that people have assumed it's true.
Correct.
But
they were assuming because he gave sort of bizarre answers or he came across weird that must mean he was trying to... must mean he was like admitting to his culpability in underage sex crimes.
But Michael, you should assume everyone goes into any interview should assume they're going to be asked the hardest possible thing they could be asked, and that is what he would be asked. There's nothing off bounds in an interview.
I would have asked maybe some questions along those lines. I'm just telling you, I object to the journalistic methodology of Emily Maitlis in the interview. Not that I would want to not out of some desire I would have to go easy on Prince Andrew.
Right. No, fair enough, yeah.
But because, if you're going to ask him tough questions, fine. I'm all for that. But again, if they're predicated on the claims of a serial fabulist, then there's a problem in the approach you're taking. That's my position anyway.
Okay. So Giuffre died last year.
This year, April of this year.
This year. She got hit by a bus, was told she had 2 days to live, ended up living a while longer.
4 days, I think. Well, she claimed that she was told that she had 4 days to live. Remember, my heuristic here, nothing she ever said or did can be taken at face value. So she claimed that she was told that she had 4 days to live because she had renal failure.
Oh, we don't have evidence that she was told that much.
No, not that I've ever seen.
Okay. And she commits suicide, what is it, a month later? Thereabouts?
Well, but it's very peculiar. So I'll just describe the whole chronology here. All of a sudden, one day in April of 2025, she posts on Instagram photos of herself with incredibly grievous wounds from what she says was this horrific bus crash in Australia where she lives, where she had a luxury oceanside mansion and she had a luxurious ranch that she was able to purchase with the proceeds from her Prince Andrew lawsuit. So this woman was like fabulously wealthy. Estimates of her fortune range from, it could be up to 60 million, I've heard it guessed. Probably 25 to 30 million is more of a lowball estimate.
How did she make money?
From her lawsuits. She was a professional victim.
Right, okay.
That was her whole identity, from Prince Andrew, from Epstein, she had individualized litigation against Epstein while he was still alive. Then once Epstein was dead, there was something called the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, which was a holistic kind of settlement mediation fund that everybody who had a claim against Epstein could make to one kind of consolidated entity, that Epstein's lawyers representing his estate and also the plaintiff's lawyers like Bradley Edwards, David Boies et al., they collaborated to set up this fund to dole out money to purported victims. And those purported victims, it was like one of the best deals of all time because they didn't have to subject themselves to any cross-examination. They could have their claims adjudicated confidentially and non-adversarially, and then they were entitled up to $5 million. And they even made eligible individuals whom claimed that they were victimized by Epstein or Epstein's associates, such as Maxwell, when they were adults. So full-fledged adults, women in their 20s, received payouts from these various funds. So you have the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, you had the J.P. Morgan settlement, which was hundreds of millions of dollars and basically copied the model of the estate settlement. Deutsche Bank, for I think it was around 80 million or just under 100 million, also copied the same model. So the floodgates opened for multi-million dollar settlements. And Virginia Roberts Giuffre was, she was the signature victim, right? So she got as much as probably could have been gotten from all of these, in addition to other settlements from other litigation that she had with Maxwell, with Epstein, etc. So, and then also she had like a book deal. We're told at the time of her death that was in the millions of dollars. She had all kinds of other income that was again solely based on her purported experiences with Epstein. So she was fabulously wealthy, hence why there's a probate dispute going on right now in Australia over her estate. She now has her brother and half-brother like on a media tour in the United States. And they spoke at this press conference last week and a rally that preceded it. And they're always weeping and they're always like saying how much they have to defend her honor or whatnot, and it's never disclosed in any of their media appearances that they're currently involved in a dispute with her estranged husband over her estate because she ended up accusing even the husband, whom she had once credited for saving her from the grips of Epstein, of now he's another abuser of hers. So I don't know how many men she claims she's been abused by over the course of her life, but it's like quite a few at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, that's why this was her whole livelihood. And so that's how she got her money. And it's never noted. I mean, did you know about that?
No.
And don't you think it's relevant? I mean, shouldn't that, isn't that some worthwhile context to at least be like minimally aware of? You would think, right? But
yes.
I'm the only guy who apparently brings it up. And when I bring it up, I'm told that I'm victim shaming or I'm defending pedophiles or all other kinds of nonsense. No, I'm just doing like basic journalistic inquest.
Right, yeah. So just on her death, though.
Yes, on the death, right.
What I'm getting from you is it's kind of hard to know what she says is true.
Right.
Her father said she didn't kill herself. But again, we can only sort of speculate about what's really going on.
My understanding is that the father would have no firsthand knowledge to make that judgment. I think he's just speculating. Okay, but what happened was, again, very bizarre sequence of events, right? She posts these photos of herself on Instagram. She has these shocking wounds, it seems like. She says they're from a bus crash. And eventually, thankfully enough, the bus driver that she claims was responsible for this accident is tracked down. And he's shown this photograph of Virginia Roberts Giuffre with these incredibly disturbing wounds, and he starts laughing. And the bus was full of children at the time, right? He starts laughing because the accident was so minor. It was a fender bender that he wouldn't have even been required to report it to police. And he says, but he did so out of an abundance of caution, just because, insurance reasons or there are children in the bus, etc. He says that when he went to go speak to the driver of the car with whom he had this very minor collision, he did not even see Virginia Roberts Giuffre in the car. He saw an older woman who it's believed to have been her caretaker. Like, of course, she had the means to have some kind of caretaker who was an older woman who, I guess, lived with her or helped her or something. But he didn't even see a passenger in the car, okay? And it's very strange. I have an intermediary who's been filing records requests in Australia. And if any Australians are listening, you have to revamp your public records laws because they're not as transparency inducing as they are in the US. Despite all the problems in the US with FOIA and freedom of information requests and whatnot, it seems even worse in Australia. So I can't get any records yet from the bus crash. I can't get any records. I can't get her death certificate. I can't get police investigation records related to her purported suicide. And also the probate dispute having to do with her estate is also seemingly secret. Now, I'm not saying that she's alive, okay? I don't know. I'm just saying I would like to have some kind of governmental record that substantiates anything that we're told happened in relation to her death. She probably is dead, if I had to guess. I'm just saying, I don't know. I would like to have some evidentiary basis to conclude that, given her bizarre story around this bus crash, which was incredibly minor, she could not have sustained the wounds or the injuries that she claimed she sustained from that bus crash, given its lack of severity, according to the bus driver, who would have no reason to lie that I can tell about this. It was just a random bus driver who she, effectively attempted to defame, yet another person she tried to defame in her whirlwind of defamatory lunacy, by saying he basically endangered a busload of children. And that's a serious thing to accuse a bus driver of. And there's really no basis for it that I know of.
So, Michael, in simple terms, what I've taken from our conversation so far is we know that Epstein was sort of sex pest from the 2005 to 2008.
He was pathologically obsessed with getting massages constantly.
Right. From young girls.
From as young of girls as he could possibly procure. But you got to bear in mind, okay, and I'm not excusing Epstein's conduct in any way.
Yes, of course.
But it is clear from the evidence that girls in the Palm Beach situation, let's say, from in the early 2000s, would often counsel one another to lie about their ages if they were not 18. Meaning to tell Epstein that they were 18 or to even have fake IDs in certain cases. Now, I think it's a bad idea. It's a disaster waiting to happen for a man in his 50s to even entertain the idea that he's going to have girls who might be from the local high school but might be technically 18 to come to the house to provide massages of varying degrees of sexualization. Horrible idea, okay? But, Epstein was probably... according to Ghislaine Maxwell, who for the first time, she says, in just July of this year, spoke to U.S. government investigators or government authorities, law enforcement officials, etc. She says for the first time, it was in July of this year that she was ever asked by anybody representing the U.S. government in any capacity to describe her role in this purported child sex trafficking that we're told it was the most prolific pedophile operation in American history. She says she was never asked about it by anyone in a governmental position until July of this year. But she gives some interesting context about Epstein's behavior around this time in the early 2000s. She says that she observed Epstein ingesting what she regarded to be disturbingly high doses of testosterone, which physiologically stands to reason would, number one, maybe make him more reckless or impulsive, and would definitely put his sex drive into overdrive, right? Yeah.
Shrink his balls.
You know what? Possibly. I guess
over time.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean that's maybe a decent point because it's interesting. He didn't. We'll just leave that to the side for now.
I'm in the speculative world now.
Now you're getting speculative, which hey, I'm all for. Although I kind of resent having to so graphically speculate about Jeffrey Epstein's anatomy. But hey, it's the life I chose. So. But so yes. And also his sexual proclivities and stuff. I now have a extensive character profile, psychosexual profile of this man, which I had never desired really. So look, but Maxwell says that, he was taking these high doses of testosterone. So again, it sort of makes sense, or it provides some, I think, worthwhile context that might at least give some explanation for why it is that he conducted himself in that way.
So the other point I'm hearing from you is 2014 is critical because although there are some weird things, not least what you've already described, but there's some weird things that have led to conspiracies that happened before that point. Is that the first point that you have high status, extremely famous people in the Epstein sex kind of world? I.e., is this the beginning of the conspiracies of an elite sex trafficking network? Yeah.
So I'll give you the turning points in terms of the proliferation or the provenance of the conspiracies, right? The first I would say was probably 2011. So that's when Virginia Giuffre first gives an interview to the Daily Mail. And she's paid $160,000 for it.
By the mail.
By the mail, yes. A lot of money. I would love to get paid that amount of money in 2011 dollars to give a light interview and maybe hand over a photo that I had. That was probably why she got paid this money, right? It was the photo that she purported to have of herself with Prince Andrew. She got 160,000 plus additional revenues from the serialization of the article because it caused a big splash at the time. I don't know if you recall. I do. And yeah, then she was strategizing with the Daily Mail journalist Sharon Churcher to potentially, marshal that notoriety or that publicity around that article into getting a book deal, maybe even getting a movie deal, getting an agent, etc. in Hollywood. But that's where she introduces that she had been amongst Prince Andrew in particular. So that's one sort of pivot point. 2014 is another one. Really, early 2015. That's when the motion for joinder became public. January of 2015, and that's the same month, right? That Gawker initially published this, excerpts from the so-called Little Black Book that had been pilfered from Epstein's Palm Beach house by a house manager of his, Alfredo Rodriguez, who then ended up getting ensnared in an FBI sting operation, went to prison. It's all. I mean, there's so many threads here that we could go down, but I'm trying to
why was he in the FBI sting? Why did he get arrested?
Okay, so Alfredo Rodriguez was a house manager for Epstein. So Epstein had all kinds of household staff because he was extremely wealthy and he had a million different estates. And Maxwell was kind of the overseer of a lot of those. And his house manager, maintenance guy, did the menial tasks associated with upkeep of the house. He worked for Epstein from 2004 to I think it was August of 2004 to February of 2005. And then he ends up getting fired. And then there's litigation underway. Bradley Edwards is leading litigation against Epstein, right? And so they're trying to find anybody possible that they can subpoena who might have information about Epstein, who might have been in his orbit or on his staff or on his payroll, etc. So they locate this guy, Alfredo Rodriguez, to come and give a deposition. And after the deposition one day, Alfredo Rodriguez calls up Bradley Edwards and says, look, I have the Holy Grail. That's how Edwards describes it. And he hadn't mentioned this under deposition, but he wanted to have like a side deal where he would sell the so-called Little Black Book, which obviously has the names of all kinds of prominent people. It's like a contact book. It's like a compilation of contacts that Epstein's household staff had in their possession in the Palm Beach house, and include Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, etc. And Alfredo Rodriguez wanted money for it because he was destitute, right? He was jobless. He was kind of desperate, so he had to fund his children's, college education and so forth. So he said to Bradley Edwards, I'm not going to give this up unless you pay me $50,000. And Bradley Edwards really wanted this Little Black Book, right? Because he wanted to bolster his litigation against Epstein, and he supposed that it contained some important evidence. But Alfredo Rodriguez wouldn't give up the book without getting a payment, which is not legal because it was under subpoena. So then Edwards goes out of his way to collude with the FBI. He became a self-admitted undercover FBI informant, which he wasn't obliged to do. There were other measures he could have taken potentially to rectify that situation. He chose to become an active FBI asset undercover informant, and he entrapped basically or ensnared Rodriguez in a sting operation, an FBI sting operation. So he got arrested. Basically they lured him to like a hotel lobby saying, hey, we'll give you the $50,000 if you hand over the book. And then, once the transaction's underway, he gets arrested.
Okay.
And then Edwards, one way or another, obtains the book at that point, and he gives it to this guy, a few years, by 2015, early 2015, the book has been transmitted to this journalist who's just a total fraud. And I know that's a harsh thing. It's, I require a big burden of proof to call a journalist a fraud. This guy's a fraud, Nick Bryant. He runs like a fake NGO called Epstein Justice. It just solicits money. God knows what they do with it. He just makes stuff up. Almost every other sentence comes out of his mouth. He's slanderous. I saw him on Breaking Points, the YouTube show. about a month ago or so now, 6 weeks ago. And he was citing a study that he claimed came from the Department of Health and Human Services that showed that 325,000 women and children are sexually trafficked in the United States every year. I didn't know of any such study existing, so I sent him an email saying, hey, can you please send me a link or a citation to the study? And he says, oh, I think you can find that information next time you visit the NAMBLA website, meaning he's calling me a pedophile. NAMBLA is like the National Man-Boy Love Association. Not that anybody watching this should be familiar with it, but, that's what he was trying to do. So He's just a fraud. But he was the one who published the article in Gawker that reported some of the contents of that so-called Little Black Book in early 2015.
Okay.
So that was a turning point in terms of the lore.
Seeing as you're claiming he's a fraud, are you implying that we don't know that those are the actual contents of the book?
Well, no, we know that the Little Black Book is out now. I mean, anybody with an internet connection can now access it. So he did have a copy of it.
Okay.
I'm saying his other journalistic conduct is fraudulent.
Okay, fine.
And also, the attempt to impugn anybody who might have appeared in that Little Black Book as somehow guilty of sex crimes or enabling of Epstein's crimes is like nonsense, because a bunch of the people in that Little Black Book really didn't even have any relationship with Epstein. They were just people whose contact information had been collected. So there have been a lot of people who have been wrongly maligned as somehow complicit in a child sex trafficking operation simply by virtue of their unknowing appearance in this Little Black Book, which I think is also very dodgy.
And the book itself presumably fuels the conspiracy that there is this elite cadre and sort of compromat.
Right. So that's a pivot point. The next one I would say is 2018, November of 2018, when there's a Miami Herald series that comes out by Julie K. Brown, who also has her own host of problems journalistically in terms of her veracity. Turns out in her book, Perversion of Justice, 2021, Julie K. Brown makes up quotes, which is kind of a serious offense in the journalism industry, or so I would have thought. No one seems to care other than me. She makes up quotes based on like invented dialogue that she just extracts from Virginia Roberts Giuffre's memoir manuscript, which her own lawyers, Virginia Roberts Giuffre's own lawyers, Edwards, Boys, etc., eventually had to admit by 2019, right, because this manuscript was written around 2011, 2012. By 2019, because it was attempted to be unearthed in litigation, in discovery, her lawyers have to admit on her behalf that this memoir was fictionalized, even though it had been presented as a nonfiction account of her experiences. Because remember, she's trying to get book deals, entertainment, reps, etc. And she's just throwing in every possible name that she can possibly identify who might have been in Epstein's circles. And because, of course, if you're an agent, you get a book proposal or something that says Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Donald, whomever, Alan Dershowitz, that might entice you to give a big deal to that person who's submitting the manuscript to you. But by 2019, she has to admit that it's fictionalized and it was written as part of like a therapeutic healing process for her. Give me a break. But Julie K. Brown, in her book, she just like invents quotes based on that manuscript, doesn't note that it was admitted by her own lawyers to be fictionalized. And you can't make up quotes anyway. But she does it and nobody checks. So anyway, she in 2018 had written this Miami Herald newspaper series that, purported to be this big expose on the non-prosecution agreement that Epstein got in Florida in 2007, 2008. That's sort of where we get the term sweetheart deal, which was never a term that was used by any prosecutors or anybody who was contemporaneously involved to describe the severity or lack thereof of the deal that Epstein got. It was just sort of like a tabloid newspaper invention, or it was a newspaper, it was a media invention years after the fact. Just like
this is from the 2005. There's a 2008 plea deal. Is this what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
But it was being described in 2018.
Okay. Well, just on that deal, though, because it's worth picking about. This is where Alexander Acosta, who was he the Florida Attorney General?
No, he was a U.S. attorney.
U.S. attorney
for the Southern District of Florida at the time that the federal non-prosecution agreement was negotiated.
Right, and he said, "I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone about that case in 2008." I don't know what exactly. No, he didn't say that.
Again, that's a central tenet of the lore that is very popular on the internet, but you got to examine the provenance of that quote. And none of these like vaunted Epstein researchers like Whitney Webb, who's supposed to be this like marvelous, intrepid researcher, right? Or
Whitney
Darryl
Webb has
Cooper.
written 2 books about
It's
it.
basically one book, supposedly a 2-volume book, but they're
About
charlatans.
Epstein specifically. Well, you don't need to convince me that Martha Maid is a charlatan. I think he's one of the most.
Well, so is Whitney.
Right. Okay. I mean, she's not doing a sort of Hitler apology, I hope. And by Hitler apology, because
Not that I know of, but I almost
Maid.
wanted to compartmentalize the World War II stuff just so we can stay focused on the
let's
task.
stay focused. Yeah, that's for another episode.
I could talk about World War II forever as well, but
okay. So let's go back to this Alexandra Acosta quote. I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone, because that's an important part of the law.
So that quote stems from a single July 2019 Daily Beast article by Vicky Ward, who was a former British tabloid journalist herself, ends up working at Vanity Fair in the early 2000s, and she authors one of the first big glossy magazine profiles of Jeffrey Epstein in 2003. And it was for Vanity Fair, right? And she, years after the fact, because all this stuff, there's so much stuff that gets sort of recast or repurposed or reconceptualized in retrospect. Years after the fact, if you go read that Vanity Fair profile, which is available from 2003, it's sort of like almost laudatory of Epstein. It's like sort of enamored of his enigmatic sort of nature, and he's like this mysterious, successful businessman. Everybody's so intrigued by him. But Vicky Ward claims that toward the tail end of the editorial process, she tried to get added to that profile sexual misconduct claims against Epstein, right? And the claims essentially revolve around this woman, Maria Farmer, who is just a total lunatic. I mean, it's unbelievable if you just do the bare minimum research on this person, that she would be touted as any kind of credible witness to anything. Like, literally, she's just crazy.
And she is claiming to be a victim of
Epstein. At age 26. So no pedophilia, right? She claims that
she could still be a victim.
She could still be a victim, but why is everybody so emotionally invested in the story? Because it supposedly has to do with a cover-up of child rape or child sex trafficking, correct? The fact that she was 26 around the time of the claimed offenses don't seem to really ever penetrate the popular consciousness, and at least when she's being cited. But she's just off her gourd, off her rocker. Crackers, to use the British term.
But so what's she got to do with the Alexandra Acosta quote?
Well, I'm going to. This is Vicky Ward, right? Vicky Ward is the one who wanted to include Maria Farmer's allegations in the original Vanity Fair profile. Yeah. And then the allegations were cut by the editor, Graydon Carter, and essentially Vicky Ward tried to make a whole sort of journalistic identity out of the fact that supposedly she was stifled when she wanted to nail Epstein in 2003, right? So then fast forward 2019, she writes something for the Daily Beast in July of 2019, and it's a very strange article. You can go look at the original still. It includes this quote, right, that became then formative in sort of crystallizing some of the online mythology around Epstein. And it said that she purports to report that 2 or 3 years before 2019, she was told by a former senior Trump White House official that Acosta had said that he was told that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and that Acosta should therefore back off, right? And, if you do a little bit of inferential reasoning, it's not tough to surmise that it was almost certainly Steve Bannon who told her this, because she was collaborating with Bannon during the relevant time period on a book basically trashing the Kushners. And Jared Kushner was Bannon's chief rival in the first Trump administration. This hasn't been confirmed. Vicky Ward won't confirm it. She won't even respond to my queries. And Bannon won't talk either, because he has this 15 plus hours of interview footage that he conducted with Epstein in 2018 or 2019. Whole nother story there. Again, so many can of worms to open. It's amazing.
We have to open the Bannon.
Okay.
So yeah, why does he so he was interviewing Epstein. I did vaguely know about that.
Okay. It's incredible. When the summer of Epstein came upon us this year, and I'm calling it the summer of Epstein, the summer of 2025. 2025, yeah, it's the best summer of my life. This is the song "The Summer of 16." Those were the best days of my life. I'm gonna compose a song, reminiscing about how wonderful the summer of Epstein was in 2025. Because, but anyway, one of the first articles I wrote was hey, are people not aware that if you want Epstein files, right? Everybody's clamoring and screaming for Epstein files, which I support. I want maximum disclosure. I'm a journalist. I'm always fighting the government to release more information. But if you want Epstein files, we don't have to speculate that the most explosive files, almost certainly, that we know to exist are in the possession of Steve Bannon. You know why? Because Steve Bannon conducted media prep session interviews with Jeffrey Epstein starting in roughly late 2018, early 2019. Because remember, think about it. You got to put yourself back in the time, right? Steve Bannon is considered to be the Svengali of Donald Trump, who powered his improbable victory in 2016. He was seen to be the communications guru for Trump. So his services were going to be in high demand. Like political parties in Europe wanted to consult with him, other organizations. And so he gets hooked up with Jeffrey Epstein by this journalist, Michael Wolff, who knew both of them. And one thing leads to another, and they basically have Bannon participate in like PR strategy sessions for Epstein after that Miami Herald series came out in November of 2018. Julie K. Brown, the author of that Miami Herald series, heralds that. She heralds the Herald series, which is strange. I didn't mean to do that. She declares with satisfaction that her Miami Herald series harnessed the cultural power of Me Too.
Right.
To breathe new life into the Epstein story and then catalyzed the re-prosecution federally of Epstein, which then culminated by July of 2019 when he's arrested and indicted. But around this time, like Epstein wants like PR advice. How does he rehabilitate his image? Steve Bannon participates in these PR sessions.
Why? What's the motivation for Bannon?
Good question. I mean, I think Steve Bannon's like maybe a bit of an odd guy. He, Epstein did have a lot of interesting connections, no doubt about it. So Bannon was probably intrigued. Maybe he was paid. We don't know. He won't answer questions. He hasn't answered my questions about it. Michael Wolff in his book jokingly recounts like that when Epstein and Bannon first met, Bannon semi-jokingly tells Epstein that you, Epstein, were the one guy I was worried about in the 2016 campaign, meaning he was the one guy that Bannon thought might have information on Trump that could actually be damaging to Trump. Now, does that mean that Bannon suspected that Epstein had information that Trump was guilty of child sex trafficking? No, not necessarily, but there's other stuff potentially that might have been embarrassing to Trump. Look at how it's roiling him now.
So might it, I mean, again, I'm speculating.
Yeah.
Summer of Me Too, 2018, I believe.
Fall.
Oh, right. So fall.
Well, it was like a year into the Me Too mania, essentially.
That makes people think about Epstein again because he's kind of a famous...
Because of the Miami Herald story, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And then Bannon is worried maybe Epstein is going to...
No, not quite. Because remember, they're meeting in late 2018. So Bannon is telling Epstein that 2 years before that,
yes,
he was worried that Epstein might have information on Trump. But the election's already won at that point.
But Trump is president.
Yes.
And there's a second election.
Right.
They'd have
in 2020, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So Bannon might...
It could still be a political liability.
That might be I'm just trying to work out what the motivation might be.
Okay, so what the idea was, the premise was that they wanted Epstein, meaning Bannon. So it's hilarious. There was one meeting that Wolff documents where the participants in this like PR prep session or strategy session for Epstein are Epstein himself, one of Epstein's lawyers, the former prime minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. So, people already have their heads exploding. And Michael Wolff, who's there transcribing or recording.
Why on earth?
And Steve Bannon.
Why is Barak there?
I don't know. Hanging out. I mean, they were associates, right? I mean, Epstein invested in Ehud Barak's businesses, or one of his businesses anyway, in Israel. And it became a huge controversy in Israel.
What year was that?
When he invested?
Yeah.
So I know it probably, this was 2018. I think the investment had been underway already for a few years. I know it came to a head during the 2019 Israeli election campaign because Netanyahu tried to use this against Ehud Barak's party.
So I remember, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, though, because that happened after he's already served 13 months for the...
Right, but almost a decade before at that point.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So,
So it's curious that Epstein isn't completely ostracized.
It seems curious, but yes, Epstein pleaded guilty in June of 2008 to those two Florida state-level charges. He then serves around 13 months of a term of incarceration by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, and then he's released, right? And then he has to register as a sex offender, et cetera. But, and then he did meet with a bunch of, many prominent individuals in the years afterwards. So, everybody from Peter Thiel to Noam Chomsky to Bill Gates to Ehud Barak, and others, Woody Allen. But if you think it through, what would, say, Peter Thiel have known Epstein did by virtue of his entry of a guilty plea, should he have been interested in investigating the facts? Well, he would have known exactly what I described to you earlier, that Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring person under 18 for prostitution. The individual identified as the sort of impetus for that charge was 17 at the time that she said that she had intercourse with Epstein, although there was several sexual contact that preceded it, starting around when she was probably 16. And she recounted that as, I think, a 19 or 20-year-old, meaning she was describing what in retrospect had occurred to her. And she wasn't especially, that aggrieved by Epstein. She was more disturbed by her being roped into a prosecution situation, where she had to testify to a grand jury. She had to interrupt her college studies, et cetera. She didn't want to have her life derailed by this because, she didn't look back on it with a huge amount of horror, it seems. And,
you're sort of making the case that it might have appeared to those individuals that the crime wasn't
especially egregious, to the point where if somebody served, and I also find it a bit strange to think, and Noam Chomsky actually made this point, because Noam Chomsky was bombarded with queries by the Wall Street Journal in 2023 asking, how could you have associated with Epstein after this? And almost every other prominent individual who the Wall Street Journal asked did this whole groveling PR approved exercise where they say that they regret their association, et cetera. It was so horrible. But Chomsky just didn't give a shit, essentially. And he said, first of all, it's none of your business. Second of all, yeah, I did meet with him. Third of all, he had served his sentence. So what are we to do? Are we to permanently banish or ostracize everybody from polite society if they've already served their sentence? I do think that is contrary to the tenets of American law, because I don't know, if somebody serves their sentence, you can never associate with them for the rest of their lives. I think that's sort of strange in terms of, due process, civil liberties, et cetera. But yeah, people try to make a big deal over the fact that he had these meetings with prominent people in the subsequent 10 years after the entry of the guilty plea. But I don't find it that peculiar, really. Especially because, he was a wealthy guy. I mean, he did convene these soirees in his houses. He had the biggest private residence in Manhattan. He had the luxury island in the Virgin Islands. He had this very interesting ranch in New Mexico. If I had been in a position to be invited, or if you had in 2014 to go visit one of these things and meet with a bunch of scientists or other interesting people that he convened from different walks of life, can I say for sure that I would have said no? No, I can't. And I don't think that should then follow me for years as though I was somehow party to some kind of cover-up of child sex trafficking. That's absurd.
Look, I want to come back to these assets that you've just laid out there, not just the property portfolio, but his immense wealth, Epstein's immense wealth. But do we need to close the loop on Bannon there? Do we?
Yeah, so on Bannon, okay, so the idea was that he was going to be, that Bannon was going to be the guy that could prepare Epstein to sit for a major network TV interview. So with 60 Minutes or Gayle King, some more conventional network TV interview to kind of clear his name. And in so doing, Bannon conducted 15 or 16 hours of preparatory interviews with Epstein. So it's on camera. Epstein never sat for a TV-style interview ever that we know of. And so you can imagine what topics would have come up over the course of those 15 or 16 hours. Certainly, Bannon would have asked Epstein about Donald Trump, who was then the sitting president, who was known to have a social relationship with Epstein. There's plenty of video and audio and photos of them cavorting with one another at parties and whatnot. So it stands to reason, right, that Bannon has Epstein on camera opining at length about Donald Trump. And you can imagine why Trump might not want that out.
Right.
Even if it doesn't, again, implicate him in any kind of underage sex crime, Just anything that could be any association at all with Jeffrey Epstein right now is politically radioactive.
Yes, that's quite right. You can see that with Trump immediately refuting any connection to the...
And there's a trailer that Bannon did put out in 2021 for some documentary he claimed that he was going to be producing, but that never came out. Where there's a very brief snippet of this on-camera footage. So we know it exists, right? He confirmed that it exists. He confirmed it to the New York Times that it existed. So we know it exists. This is not speculation. So my point is, if you want Epstein files, I want Epstein files, you want Epstein files, we all want Epstein files, okay? Let's, shout hurrah for the Epstein files. Shouldn't people be shouldn't these podcaster creatures and others like Darryl Cooper or Whitney Webb or whomever, shouldn't they be beating down Steve Bannon's door saying, release your 15 or 16 hours of interview footage with Jeffrey Epstein? Right?
Yeah.
You would think so. Actually, Ro Khanna, who was the co-organizer of this press conference last week, one reason why I was invited by him and his staff to participate in that press conference because I had been in communication with Ro Khanna about this whole Bannon angle, because Ro Khanna said he hadn't been aware of this footage existing. I informed him about it, and Ro Khanna said he was going to pursue potentially issuing a subpoena to Steve Bannon to turn over that interview footage, which I'd be in favor of. I mean, let's have maximum disclosure, maximum transparency, right? And so that's underscores the irony of my having been forcibly objected by.
That could be legally done?
Yes. The House Oversight Committee is, as we speak, engaged in an investigation where they're subpoenaing all different entities, including private entities. They just subpoenaed Epstein's estate. That's why we got that birthday book this past week.
Right.
It was the House Oversight Committee subpoenaing Epstein's estate for materials.
The weirdest birthday book I've ever seen. We're going to come back to that because, as a consequence, the British ambassador, Peter Mandelson, has been sacked because of his lengthy contribution to it.
By the way, do you see how you're always having to steer me back to things? Because there's so many loose ends here. It's unbelievable. Like, we could spend the rest of the night.
Well, you know what? Actually, it's precisely because there are so many loose ends.
Yes.
Precisely because there's so many endless stories.
Yes.
That if you come at the Epstein story and not really understand what's going on, and you want to sort of assess all of the, it's an Israeli Mossad sex, whatever, honeypot trap thing, and it's the evil Jews or whatever it is. There's so much that it's so hard to access.
Yes,
that it's we've done a couple of episodes on it, but it's even researching for it. It's like hard to know where to start.
Yeah.
So why I'm particularly enjoying this is because you're very clear about what we definitely know and what is speculative.
Yes,
which
I try to
journalists
be. At least aspire to be.
Yeah.
Apparently it's out of fashion these days.
Well, it doesn't get you the views and clicks, I imagine. Well, certainly the conspirators are getting lots of views and clicks.
Yeah.
So, look, you painted a picture of his property portfolio. You got the New York townhouse, which he was gifted from Les Wexler, who was the businessman behind.
Well, perhaps not gifted, given as compensation in lieu of monetary remuneration.
Okay, well,
that's what Maxwell says.
Well, let's start that then with the business side of things, because some people have said he's so insanely rich, we don't know where his money came from. It doesn't seem like it come from any. There's no money trace. It must be a state, and a lot of those people go say it must be Israel. So, I'd love to know, like, the best case. For what we know, the provenance of his money.
What I have found is that the people who shout the loudest that we don't know how Epstein acquired his wealth are also the least interested in actually consuming the material that is available in the public record that sheds at least some light on how he did acquire his wealth. Not that we have a fully comprehensive account. I've been saying I would love if every penny that he ever obtained could be forensically audited and we could get a totally complete picture of how he acquired his wealth. But that said, there is some information, right? So, and a lot of that, and there were a lot of additional details given in that Maxwell proffer interview that she did with the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, for the first time that she was ever asked about any of this in terms of her role in the purportedly most prolific child sex trafficking ring of all time. And she describes what Epstein did for Wexner. Because, one of the sort of linchpins of people's wild theories around this is, how could it be possible? How could there be any above board explanation for why Epstein would have been given power of attorney over Leslie Wexner's affairs, right? Mm-hmm. And look, if people want to make the case that the way these like insanely wealthy people live is like it's self-suspicious and how they like move money around, how they evade taxes and whatnot. If you want to make a critique on those along those lines, I'm all for it. But that's not what people are really doing for the most part. They want to just throw out a few sort of disparate data points and then invite everyone to make the most salacious possible inference. Usually not based on much that's tangible in terms of evidence. Like that's what Whitney Webb chronically does, and Darryl Cooper. So Maxwell in this proffer interview, and I've been saying, if you're out there, Todd Blanche, thank you for conducting this interview, because it's actually a public service, seriously, because so much of this narrative is informed like exclusively, meaning the narrative around Epstein writ large is informed exclusively by plaintiffs' attorneys like Bradley Edwards and David Boies, who obviously have one specific case that they're trying to make. Chronic fabricating so-called survivors or victims. Not saying every victim is totally lacking in credibility, but the most prominent ones tend to be severely lacking in credibility. And they're the ones who've informed the public narrative to a large degree with their Netflix specials, with, I don't know, BBC Panorama specials and all this.
Wait, you're suggesting the Netflix special was
Filthy Rich?
Yeah.
Horrible. Just horrible. And I'll give you one example, okay?
Horrible as in?
Horrible in terms of how misinforming it is, how deceitful it is.
Wow.
Yep.
Well, you got to tell me, because I fell for that one.
Yeah, I would imagine, I'm not surprised, a lot of people did. Because if you go into it just without any background information, then you have no basis to like cross-check claims or like wonder, okay, is this being accurately represented, right? You're just sort of like turning off when people just vegetate in front of Netflix for the most part, they're not like engaging in their critical thinking, right? Yes, they're just like consuming entertainment. So I'll give you one example, right? There's this Netflix show, it's called Filthy Rich, right? It's from 2020. Actually, it got a huge surge in viewership this summer, like up by 600% or something on Netflix because of the whole uproar around so-called Epstein files and the FBI DOJ memo of July 6th, et cetera, Trump's involvement. I'll give you one example. Okay, so there's this woman, Sarah Ransom, who's shown as her title on the Netflix documentary is Survivor, as though that's her profession, right? She is a South African woman. She lived in the UK for a time. Then she goes to the United States, New York City, when she's 22. And she encounters Epstein's organization eventually as an adult. Okay. And she says that she's asked in a deposition, which of course is referenced nowhere in this documentary, even though it was available. She says in a documentary, she says in the deposition, she's asked by the lawyer deposing her, so how is it that you made a living, or how did you generate income around this time that you first came to New York as an aspiring model of some sort, right? She says, through an agency, which she doesn't specify what agency, but she says, through an agency, I would be offered opportunities to go have dinner with gentlemen and receive $1,500 for my time. And she says that there would be occasions when she would find the gentleman attractive and have consensual sexual relations with them. So that's what she was involved in. Mm. And then she gets involved subsequently in Epstein sort of operation. She does go to the Virgin Islands, the private island, the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands. And so, but here's why it's so ridiculous that she's just kind of generically described as survivor, as though she has unblemished, unimpeached credibility, right? As in her survivorship. By the way, when were we all required to use the term survivor? It's kind of creepy, like the TV show. I mean, the reality TV show, or it's just weird. It's just sort of like
Me Too, right?
Maybe it just seems like weirdly emotionally manipulative to me. Survivor, like you survived a natural disaster or something. Anyway, just a weird sort of semantic.
Survivor comes from the Holocaust. So the first.
Yeah, Holocaust survivor. Yeah, you're right.
The original term,
right? The Epstein Holocaust. Yeah,
that might actually be the point. It's a bit like the word denial. The first use of the term is Holocaust denial. Mm. And so when people say climate denial, it's invoking something as egregious as denying the Holocaust.
Actually, I hadn't thought about that. It's a good point. It's like survivor is almost invoking like historical wrong or something, historic wrong, like putting it in the pantheon of historical injustices or something.
But I mean, look, I think it's fair to say some of these women, and maybe you'll agree, some of the women in the Netflix must have been survivors of some sort of.
You think, but let me just finish out the Sarah Ransom thing, right? Because she's, again, she's depicted as this professional survivor. Weirdly, if you watch the documentary, she's living what seems to be a very comfortable lifestyle in Catalonia, Spain. And how did she come to acquire that lifestyle, right? Well, she got a lot of settlement money. But here's the kicker, right? So she in October of 2016, she starts emailing a New York Post journalist, Maureen Callahan, saying, "I'm an Epstein survivor. Look at me. I have sex tapes on Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Richard Branson. And my mission is to ensure that who she calls pedophile Trump does not get elected president. And she also wants to ensure that who she calls that evil bitch Hillary doesn't get elected president." Now, I don't know who she thought was going to get elected other than the two of them. Maybe she was a big fan of Gary Johnson or the Green Party or something. I don't think she particularly understood the nuances of the American political system, but that's what she thought her mission was, right?
They can get complicated.
Yeah. And so, she was a libertarian at the time, maybe. And so she says she has these sex tapes, right? Because one of the theories that have been percolating is that Epstein supposedly wired all his houses or all his properties in the private areas, like a bedroom or a bathroom or something, which there's really not a whole lot of evidence for to begin with. Mm-hmm. But she claimed that she had this footage, right? And you can go read her emails. Like, anybody listening, please don't take my word for any of this. If you want, you can contact me and I will provide you with the material to review for yourself. Okay. Like probably around 95% of like the journalism reporting I've done on this topic has been through material that's in the public record. Maybe 5% just based on private discussions I've had or whatever, like original reporting. So I've done some of that, but like for the overwhelming majority, it's all stuff that people can read for themselves. Uh-huh. And Sarah Ransom's emails came out in Discovery, where she's trying to tell this New York Post journalist that she has these sex tapes on these prominent people, and she single-handedly is going to determine the course of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. What happens? She admits she made the whole thing up. She did not have any sex tapes. No such sex tapes existed. She retracts the claims to the journalist. She then tells other journalists later that she made it up because she wanted to present as though she had leverage over Jeffrey Epstein, whom she feared was going to harm her. Again, no evidence ever that she was actually in legitimate harm. Again, paranoid, crazy women. But on this Netflix documentary, she's just an unsullied survivor with utmost credibility. So it's a deception and a fraud on the audience. And that's just one example.
Huh. Okay, so we were discussing how Epstein got his money and how he got his assets. You say, what about his businesses do we know that were legitimate?
So here's what Ghislaine Maxwell says in her proffer interview. And if anybody's even slightly interested in this story, I would really recommend, and it's accessible, just Google it. You can read the full transcript of her proffer interview. I think it was July 22nd, and it was published by the Department of Justice in late August. She's asked by Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, to describe her observations of Epstein's business activities. And Maxwell, at this point, clearly is not inclined to exonerate Epstein fully, or to avoid providing information that might reflect negatively on Epstein, like she does say.
2025.
2025, yeah. This is July. This is like 6 weeks ago.
Okay, yeah.
Because she's in prison. I mean, she's been in prison for 5 years. She has 15 to go, according to what she's been sentenced. And so she's basically just throwing it all out there. You know, I'm not saying that she's 100% truthful in every possible respect, but, you know, it's at least worth entertaining that she's giving her best approximation of the truth, if only in service of potentially getting clemency, because otherwise she's spending the next 15 years in prison. And I think she's in her early 60s at this point. So that's not very pleasant. And she was subjected to incredibly brutal incarceral conditions as well. Like when she was first jailed, like in the federal jail facility prior to her trial in 2021, it was a federal jail facility in Brooklyn where the guards would come and wake her up every 15 minutes. She couldn't sleep. Basically torturous conditions, solitary confinement, etc., because she was seen as the proxy for Epstein, who was dead at that point. And somebody needed to pay, right, for Epstein's purported crimes, and she was the next one in line.
But she hadn't been found guilty at that point.
Not at that point, no.
Right.
This was pre-conviction.
Yeah, so we'll come back to her conviction.
Right. So in terms of what she said, here's what she says about Epstein's business activities, right? She says she observed him doing work constantly, like what she regarded to be legitimate work. She actually ran for a time basically his private office, where she was saying like they employed accountants, they employed lawyers, they employed other staff, and it was a money management business for mostly high wealth, high net worth clientele.
Mm-hmm.
But she also observed his relationship with Wexner, who she does say was his most important client by far. Leslie Wexner was at this time one of the most wealthy men in the United States. So I think his net worth was like 8 or 9 billion, something like that. And this is, I don't quote me on the exact amount, but whatever it was, this would have been in like the 90s, right? So adjust for inflation, right? And she says that she observed Epstein, for example, restructuring all of Wexner's businesses financially. I'm not a financial guy really, so I can't probably give you the best explanation of what that would entail, but it seems like pretty complex financial work, and that's what Epstein specialized in.
And this is when he had set up his own business, Epstein.
He already had that, yeah.
Okay.
He set that up in the 80s.
Okay.
But by the 90s, he gets power of attorney with Wexner.
So he's just working as an independent.
Yeah, he has like a boutique firm, essentially.
Okay.
So he used his experience in Bear Stearns when he was in his 20s still. He wrote, while he worked for Bear Stearns in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, he rose through the ranks pretty quickly. He clearly was some kind of math prodigy. I don't know if he wasn't maybe the biggest genius to ever walk the earth, but he did have a proficiency in math. And in Bear Stearns, he ended up like sort of innovating certain financial instruments to aid very wealthy people in terms of how they structured their finances. And then he parlayed that into a boutique firm that he established that was sort of his namesake firm. And then by the 90s, he gets into this relationship with Wexner, who's the owner of Victoria's Secret, owner of The Limited, other women's clothing retailers, and all kinds of other business holdings as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so Maxwell says she observed Epstein restructuring his business holdings. Seems pretty complicated to me. I don't know, for a guy worth $8 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Epstein oversaw the finances of Wexner's property developments. So he had a property developments that he had in Ohio. He had a country club in Ohio that Epstein also oversaw the finances for. Epstein basically ran the finances for Wexner's staff that like worked on his houses or whatever staff that Wexner had, right? Epstein drafted essentially the trust fund agreements for Wexner's children. So he had a lot to do. And Epstein also had, according to Maxwell, Epstein also had his own business endeavors, meaning he invested in certain businesses and then played an active role in running the business to some extent. So there was a sporting goods retailer whose name now escapes me that Epstein had a significant investment in that he then ended up running, helping to manage in some fashion, according to Maxwell. And then he also had other high net worth clients that he did something similar for Wexner, although on a smaller scale. Wexner was his most important client for sure, according to Maxwell, but he also provided similar services to Elizabeth Johnson, who would have been the heiress for the Johnson & Johnson family fortune. Leon Black, who's another hedge fund billionaire. Some of this was already known in the public record, but Maxwell really fills in some details in this proffer interview, which I recommend people read or listen to. You can even listen to the audio if you're reading impaired. And some others. So in other words, Epstein did, there is a good deal of evidence that Epstein did perform work of some kind, right? So I'm not saying we know everything. I'm not saying I wouldn't like to know more. I would. That's why I'm all for full disclosure, every Epstein file everywhere. The people who demand Epstein files, ironically enough, often will actually not call for full disclosure because they will allow for a huge range of files to continue to be concealed on the grounds that we have to protect the privacy rights of victims. So if you look at that Massey-Khanna bill, that was sort of the part of the impetus for that press conference last week, and you read it, I know I did something very controversial. I read the bill. It includes exceptions that would allow the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to continue concealing Epstein files if she determines that the privacy interests of purported victims might be infringed upon. Now, all these purported victims are now adults. Like the earliest possible Epstein quote-unquote victim would have to be in like their 30s. So what, we're supposed to accept that in perpetuity, none of these files can ever be released because there could be some claim of a privacy interest to keep them concealed? That's not full disclosure. That's not full transparency. And even there's...
But just because of their age doesn't mean they wouldn't want the privacy of what happened
Perhaps.
had they been abused. And just to colour that in, it was earlier this year, Pam Bondi said, tomorrow, and she is the Attorney General, she said, tomorrow we're releasing the files.
Right.
And tomorrow came round and she said, no, we've got to protect. This is just colouring in what you've said. We've got to protect the victims.
She distributed these fake prop binders to a bunch of right-wing influencers, too.
And they walked out of the White House with folders that said Epstein files, and then they opened it up and just everything's redacted.
Yeah, they were waving it around like they just won the Super Bowl, like they were hoisting up the trophy or something. It was embarrassing.
This is a side point, but why all of this hoo-ha and dramatics from the Trump administration if there is nothing?
No, it's a good question.
What on earth are they playing at with that whole sort of...
Well, I mean, my contention is not that there is nothing, right? I think there is a lot of probably interesting material that is still in the possession of different branches of the government, whether it's the judiciary, which has plenty of materials, particularly Southern District of New York and in Florida, South Florida, that would be very revelatory, but revelatory for reasons that maybe might surprise some people, because if the full scope of information were released, it might show that some of these central Epstein accusers or victims or survivors had a good deal of problems in terms of the veracity of their stories. And we don't want that information, right? We want to make sure that's concealed in perpetuity. So you say, despite their ages today, they still might want to have materials concealed from their past. Okay, I guess my argument would be...
Wouldn't that be inconsistent with what Trump said, is that there's nothing to hide? Why wouldn't he want it proved that there is nothing?
Because, I mean, look at this birthday book thing, right? Trump apparently wrote a letter to Jeffrey Epstein. A jokey sort of, sexually maybe...
You mean the page from the birthday book?
Yeah, so this...
We'll put an asset up. So
okay, yeah.
It's kind of boobs.
A Sharpie,
with some writing,
image of a woman,
and then his signature at the bottom.
Right, so...
Which he's denying is his signature.
I don't really buy the denial. Yeah. I don't think I never bought that the Wall Street Journal would just fabricate the existence of that birthday card.
Particularly as others have been authenticated.
Yes.
Like, why would Peter Mandelson be sacked if Mandelson had been?
And so Trump immediately sued the Wall Street Journal when they first reported on the existence of that birthday card in July, and the lawsuit didn't make any sense to me. And it was like shooting himself in his foot politically, I thought, because what would be the problem? Just if I were advising him, which I'm not, although I have talked to people around the White House who kind of are in rough sympathy with my approach to this because they think basically I'm on target, which is not always the case in terms of the people in power, right? In terms of what I journalistically cover, but hey, strange bedfellows. If I were advising Trump, I would just say there's no reason to obstinately deny that this is real. We know you have the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. It's not some big mystery. You obviously socialized with him. We know you flew on each other's planes. It's in the flight logs. You can't keep this hidden in perpetuity. I would just admit that it's a real card and insist that it does not show that you are somehow guilty of committing child sex crimes. Yeah. That's absurd.
So you think he's just butchered the whole PR strategy around the Epstein?
Yeah, I mean, he adds fuel to the fire every time he opens his mouth because he just says hoax or it's bullshit. And what does the uninformed observer infer from that? Oh, that must mean he wants to cover up something incredibly salacious. Right. I don't think that's what it shows at all. I think it shows that Trump, just by reflex, likes to, aggressively deny the veracity or the
I suspect
the veracity of any media reporting that he thinks is politically detrimental to him.
Yeah. Which, by the way, he did with Project 2025. So he denied anything to do with it, and then the next day called up the head of the Heritage Foundation to say, I had to do it. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So he always does that.
Yeah. So look, let's go back to the assets. With the various jobs that it seems he had and various work he was doing, do you think that it's it's feasible that he acquired the amount of wealth that he did. That 4 or 5 properties, the Boeing 727, and I've read $600 million worth. Is that accurate?
Well, when he was arrested, when he was re-arrested federally in July of 2019, there were pre-trial motions and hearings, and one of them was around the potential of him getting granted bail. And pursuant to that bail motion, he had to disclose his assets, right? And his lawyers divulged on his behalf that his net worth or his assets totaled around $600 million at the time. And, that's a lot of money, no doubt about it. But I just don't really buy that it's that implausible that he could have accumulated it, especially given, like, Alan Dershowitz, who represented Epstein, right, in the 2007-2008 Florida ordeal, said that he was told by Epstein that in relation to his work with Leslie Wexner, he would get 1% of his annual revenues or something to that effect. So if Leslie Wexner was worth $8 or $9 billion when Epstein started working with him, whatever the revenue was on a given year, like, do the arithmetic as to what that would add up to cumulatively. And then he had these other high net worth clients who were also billionaires or heiresses or what have you. He had his other, like, enterprises or endeavors. It's just not that crazy to me. Now, look, maybe he stored some money offshore. I would not be surprised in the slightest about that. His whole craft was about devising strategies for wealthy people to save their money or to do some tax avoidance or whatnot. So that wouldn't surprise me. I just think that the supposed mystery that people want to insist must exist,
right,
is exaggerated, and it's based on confirmation bias. Like, people want to believe that there's this huge mystery, right? Because then that would entitle them to posit all these other extravagant claims around Mossad or CIA or intelligence ties or what have you, or basically just argue that the supposed lack of information is itself evidence that something much more sinister and grandiose must have happened.
Right. So there's one aspect of his income which seems to me probably put him, if there's an argument that he had there was a legitimate reason why he's doing international business, maybe even why he has 4 passports, which I'd love to get into with you.
Well, I'm not sure about that. 4 passports? He had 4?
Saudi, Israeli, Austrian, and American is what I've understood.
Okay, so when he was arrested in 2019, right, the issue of his multiple passports came up. The only passport that it's confirmed in terms of what his defense attorneys acknowledge, and maybe they don't acknowledge other passports, I'm not sure, but in terms of what was seized from the New York house, it was his regular passport, and then he did have an expired Austrian passport, which his lawyers say he was advised to obtain when he was doing business in the Middle East. He was told that you wouldn't necessarily want to divulge that you were Jewish if you were doing business in the Middle East. So he had this mocked up Austrian passport that's not even clear if he ever used. But in terms of 4 passports, I'm not aware of him having 4.
Mike Benz claims, who's been on the show, claims it was used. There's 4 steps.
Well, you got to examine the claims of some of these self-proclaimed researchers.
So you're saying you've not seen evidence that there's an Israeli or Saudi passport?
I've seen evidence that there was an expired Austrian passport that was seized from one of his safes in the New York house after he was arrested in 2019. If there's evidence elsewhere, like if Mike Benz has evidence of the other passports, I'm happy to look at it.
Yeah, right. So what is that work in the Middle East then? Is that the work he was doing with the guns arms brokering?
Yeah, this is, I'll acknowledge, this sort of whole phase of his life, like in the 80s roughly, when he did have these business dealings that in relation to the Middle East, it's not as well chronicled.
Yes.
So, that's true. I think he...
So this is important, right? So you have Sir Douglas Leese.
Yes.
Who's a British arms dealer. Not only does he introduce, and you have to correct if I get any mistakes.
Okay.
Right? Not only does he introduce Epstein to Robert Maxwell, and he's also connects him to a man called Adnan Khashoggi, who's I believe a Saudi arms dealer, as well as Ari Ben Manash, an Israeli arms dealer. And
see, I'm not so sure about the Ben Menash thing in terms of Epstein being introduced to him. Okay, this is an
maybe.
area where I have a less of like rigorously established knowledge, just because like the sourcing is odd. Like I love when you can like get some court documents and you can get some like really solid firsthand materials. And in terms of that, the goings on in the 80s, I'm just less well versed in it. Like I know it does the thing with Sir Douglas Lease, I think is somewhat well established that he had, but like and it's clear that like it probably is the case that that's like through whatever circles he was running in at that point, he possibly met Robert Maxwell.
If not, okay, then.
Although it's unclear. I mean, the timelines are like contradictory here. So, but like, I guess like my question would be, okay, so what is the inference we're supposed to be drawing from this? That like, therefore Mossad ran a child sex trafficking honeypot operation, right?
No.
I just feel like there are logical leaps you want to make based on potential gaps in the record.
Well, what we're trying to do is establish the provenance of these conspiracies.
Okay.
It seems to me that if he was doing arms dealing in the 80s, around the Iraq-Iran war, that's what
maybe not dealing arms himself, but maybe providing financial services.
Right. He might be entangled somehow. Yeah. So he's working in the Middle East with Israelis, and he has the passport. It's sort of, for me, it kind of makes the idea that there's actually a possible, more legitimate answer than he's some sort of Mossad.
Yeah. I mean, I have never claimed that it's entirely implausible that he could have interfaced with individuals who could be connected in one way or another to some intelligence agency. I mean, just by virtue of his relationship with Ehud Barak, which was more toward, my understanding is, kind of like the mid-2010s. Even so, though, I mean, Ehud Barak would have been, as a former prime minister of Israel, would have overseen the Mossad. He would have overseen other military entities in Israel. So, yeah, I mean, just by virtue of him ferrying around Bill Clinton in 2002 on his private jet, look, I mean, that's a connection, I guess, to a former president who would have overseen the CIA, would have overseen the NSA, et cetera, when he was president. He did have a social relationship with the current president. So, like, look, I mean, but I guess my question would be, okay, so then what are we to infer from this tie, right? Like,
well, I'm not actually,
or this dot, like you want to connect you want to posit the existence of a data point, which I'll grant, but then you want to dot connect it using like a spurious leap of logic that I just don't think is like grounded in anything.
Well, that's precisely why I bring it up, because it does seem to me that that's a spurious leap.
Yes.
And so, but I'm trying to work out exactly what is true.
Right.
Because then we work out how ideas.
I guess I will, I mean, if people want to think this is a cop-out, fine. I just don't feel like I have a full enough knowledge based on the information that's available and how it gets kind of twisted and contorted by a lot of these like self-appointed researchers and so forth. In terms of the events in the 80s with Khashoggi, with Sir Douglas Lease, there's only like little bits and pieces and snippets and fragments. And I'm just not confident enough to opine authoritatively on like, to give you like a master theory of what went on during that period.
Well, I think you just even saying that gives authority to everything else you've said in the conversation. So good on you. But presumably you must know about Robert Maxwell, which we can't.
Yes.
We have to talk about the Maxwell family, because this is where also a lot of the Israeli conspiracies come from. Maxwell's involvement with the founding of Israel, and I've heard one claim that Mossad was all over his funeral, or rather half the attendants were Mossad agents. So what is the story with Robert Maxwell and how Epstein meets him?
Okay. So, and again, this is why everyone should be thankful that Ghislaine Maxwell gave that proffer interview finally, after all these years when no government official ever asked her any questions about her involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, which is totally bizarre. But she says that she actually met Donald Trump, believe it or not, in the early 90s before she ever met Epstein, because her father, Robert Maxwell, in 1991 had purchased the New York Daily News. And Donald Trump around this time was like one of the most prominent tabloid celebrities in New York City. Robert Maxwell had also purchased in the 80s, is it the Daily Mirror? I think so, in the UK. So he was like a media baron. He had other holdings as well. And then, the conventional story is that he was like cooking the books. His business kind of collapsed. And then in 1991, he dies mysteriously aboard his yacht, and he's found like floating face down in the water, right? But Maxwell says that her father introduced her to Donald Trump, and it was before she even met Epstein, right? And now Maxwell, I'm pretty sure in that interview, and again, I would have to go double check. Like, I try not to state stuff authoritatively if my memory is at all fuzzy, because there's such a huge volume of information here. My recollection is that in that proffer interview, Maxwell says that her father never met Epstein. So it's not clear that Epstein and Robert Maxwell ever interfaced. Now, would it be that crazy if they had interfaced in like the 80s or something? No, not necessarily. Through like Epstein's various business endeavors. But at least according to what Ghislaine knew, I'm pretty sure she says that Epstein never met her father. But don't quote me on that. I would have to go double check. But I think the leap of logic here is that because Robert Maxwell is known, like once Robert Maxwell died, right, information came out around his involvement in the 1948 Arab Israeli War. So the Israelis call it the War of Independence. The Palestinians will call it the Nakba or something like that. But Robert Maxwell evidently was integral in trafficking arms from Czechoslovakia, his native land, to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, and for use in that war between the Jews and the Arabs. And this was after Robert Maxwell had served in the Second World War in the British military. And then, as he became a business titan, he did become like a benefactor, we're told, of Israel, although I don't know what beneficence exactly he gave. But he clearly was a supporter of Israel. He was a ardent, backer of Israel. There is some evidence that when this Ben Minaj character came to the UK to try to entice newspapers to report on his knowledge of Israeli nuclear secrets, Robert Maxwell might have told Israeli authorities that, hey, you have this, traitor or something who's trying to spill the beans on your nuclear program, which, was officially still a secret at that time. Actually, still is officially a secret, even though everybody knows it exists. And then, yes, once he dies, he's given an honorary burial on the Mount of Olives, which is annexed to East Jerusalem, or people could argue with the term annexed, but we don't have to get into that. But it's a place where, like the most high profile or esteemed, like, foreign friends of Israel are allowed to have an honorary burial.
Prestigious place you can be buried.
Yeah. So Sheldon Adelson, who was the top Republican donor in the U.S. for many years, hardcore pro-Israel. He was a casino magnate in Las Vegas, also in Macau. Multi-billionaire, and gave a huge amount of money to Republican causes. His widow, now Miriam Adelson, continues to do so. When he died in early 2021, he died in Malibu, California. A plane took his body from California to the Mount of Olives. He also received one of these honorary burials, and many dignitaries in Israel attended. So Netanyahu attended that burial, etc. So Robert Maxwell clearly got something similar after he died. Now, does it stand to reason that somebody from Mossad was there? Sure. But again, what's the leap of logic we're supposed to make? That Therefore, because Robert Maxwell had an honorary funeral or honorary burial in the Mount of Olives, that Jeffrey Epstein was running a child sex trafficking ring at the behest of the Mossad like 10 or 15 years later in Florida?
Right.
Like, that just doesn't jive.
It's circumstantial.
But it's not even circumstantial. It's just like a bunch of random facts that people want to cohere into a tantalizing narrative without much basis at all. Right? And like, okay, but so let's even stipulate that Robert Maxwell, if not having been personally a Mossad agent, which I doubt he was, but like still an asset of some kind, or a benefactor, or whatever you want to characterize his relationship as with the Israeli state. Let's just stipulate that that's all true. Okay, so then we're therefore to conclude that his youngest daughter, Ghislaine, must have also been an Israeli asset, like based on what? Like, I don't know, like, am I automatically roped in with everything my father has ever done? It's just like a weird, I think, fallacy that people cling to because it forms like one of the planks of this mythology that they've erected. And, Maxwell was asked about this by Todd Blanche, at which he had asked a few more questions actually and pursued the line of inquiry a little bit further. But she denies that she ever knowingly encountered anybody that was associated with Israeli intelligence. Now, again, was she lying? Was she telling the full truth? Difficult to say, but it's at least a piece of evidence to take into consideration. And yeah, so I just find that this whole theory that because Robert Maxwell must was buried in the Mount of Olives, Jeffrey Epstein circa 2004 must have been running a pedophilic sex trafficking ring at the direction of Israel to just be a totally ridiculous sort of extrapolation that is really not based on anything of substance other than people's really disturbing and strange desire to want to believe that pedophilic rings are incredibly rampant and dictate how our affairs are governed. That's an irony of all this too. People seem really bizarrely invested, creepily invested in pedophilic sex trafficking being much more pervasive than it appears to be. Why would you want on any level there to actually to be rampant pedophilic sex trafficking?
This might be interesting to explore as a side, which is who is exactly invested? Because I think I've seen some polling, Batcha Unga Sargon showed me some polling that the average American doesn't care about Epstein. Is that wrong, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think it would depend on how you phrase the question. I mean, I think if you ask the average American, would it bother you if the elites who run our society are covering up a vast child sex trafficking ring?
Yes.
That victimize countless numbers of innocent children. What are people going to say? No? So it depends how you ask the question.
Right, I see what you mean. It's also the case that I think Batcha made this point. Given the story is so salacious and that it involves the Jews, it has the ability, certainly online, to be widely spread across the world by the vast anti-Semitic populations of other civilizations, not just our own.
Perhaps, yeah. I think there's plenty of homegrown people who are willing to spread it as well, where, maybe they're Pakistanis involved or something. I don't know. But
well, there's definitely sort of American anti-Semites.
Yeah.
We've hinted at a few of them.
One of my big problems with this, take a more broad-based view or to step back, is that I really resent that. I resent a few things, a few ramifications of the story that I consider to be really damaging. Number one, collapse of journalistic standards. So I gave you just a couple examples. Julie K. Brown, Darryl Cooper, who I guess is in the media or some kind of journalist. He calls himself an audio documentary maker, whatever the hell that is. Whitney Webb, this other woman, Tara Palmieri.
The even reason I bring these people up, people listening might be I have no idea who we're talking about, but these people have millions of followers on social media and they have popular shows. Ian Carroll, I heard him on, he's been on Rogan, so is Darryl Cooper. And even after Charlie Kirk's death, some of these guys are immediately blaming Israel.
Sure.
Take a moment, we know nothing about it. They say Israel, as if there's any evidence.
Ian Carroll in particular noted that, but he even goes beyond these characters I think they're charlatans. It even implicates the more mainstream media. CNN is 24/7 Epstein Central now, or at least was before Charlie Kirk got shot, with the birthday book and every other little development that comes out, right? And look, I'm covering Epstein too, so I'm not trying to say that I'm not contributing to this in some fashion, although I'm coming from a radically different perspective than virtually anyone else. But, you'll have CNN and MSNBC and ABC and so forth. They will just credulously refer to all these adult, to women. After this press conference, right, they choreographed a bunch of interviews with so-called Epstein survivors. Because one of the news hooks of the supposed press conference was going to be that they were going to debut new survivors who were going to tell their story for the first time. Woohoo. And, if you actually watch the press conference and watch this rally that preceded it, so many, one after another, of these supposed victims or survivors that came out to tell their story.
There's about 10 of them, right?
I think there might have been a little bit more than that.
Okay.
And I tried to interview a bunch of them. They weren't really happy about that. I tried to be polite, but, if you ask even the most modestly critical question of any of these people who are involved in this, I call Epstein Survivors, Inc. You're basically seen as this dangerous interloper.
Right.
But so many of them, one after the next, were adults at the time that they claimed that they were sexually victimized by Epstein. But you know what they do? They allow themselves to
they can't be victimized.
I know, but they're allowing themselves to be conflated with child sex trafficking victims. And then the media participates in that conflation because they don't make any differentiations. They don't distinguish. Yeah. And then what does the average news consumer assume?
Yes.
That an Epstein victim or survivor must have been a child sex trafficking victim. So we're told, the average news consumer is told that there are over 1,000 Epstein victims based on this, probably almost certainly BS figure that was cooked up by the DOJ and FBI with their memo from July 6th. So the average news consumer thinks, oh my God, over 1,000 child sex trafficking victims. That's horrible. We got to get to the bottom of this. Donald Trump is covering this up. Trump is covering up for pedophiles. Whoa. I mean, it's based on media malfeasance. It's journalistic ineptitude or cowardice to not distinguish between these people. So, I'm sorry if ABC News is interviewing this whole group of purported Epstein victims, and half of the women sitting there don't even claim that they would have been, could be attesting to a child sex trafficking ring. Don't you think that's useful information to clarify for the viewers? But they don't do it, because so many journalists see themselves. They see their proper role journalistically as serving as PR agents for the supposed victims, even though so many of them are multimillionaires. They got these tax-free settlement monies. They're wealthy. We're supposed to all think of them as downtrodden victims, right? Well, I mean, I talked to one of them, this woman, Miss Phillips, who told me, I asked her just how much money, she confirmed to me that she got money from this JP Morgan settlement payout.
Can you explain why the JP Morgan, you mentioned this right at the beginning of the conversation, why are JP Morgan doing a settlement?
Yeah, it's very convoluted, right? So Bradley Edwards and David Boies and all these lawyers who made Epstein central to their identity decided that they would sue JP Morgan and then Deutsche Bank for having allegedly been complicit in enabling Epstein's sex trafficking ring, right? So after they got the conviction of Maxwell in 2021, and I maintain that she was wrongfully convicted with 95+% certainty.
She was convicted, just to remind people, of sex trafficking.
She was convicted of several counts, that included trafficking. And the trafficking conspiracy of which she was convicted, according to the government, according to the 4 alleged victims that the government called to testify against her, that conspiracy that she was convicted of being party to consisted of 2 people, herself and Jeffrey Epstein. So not a particularly vast conspiracy, kind of strange.
I haven't understood. The party of traffickers, you mean?
Yeah, the sex trafficking conspiracy consisted of 2 people. That's the claim.
Right, okay. So the idea being that she brought girls to him.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. So that's actually important because I think it was Tucker Carlson who pushed the idea she's doing sex trafficking. Of course that there must be, who's she trafficking the girls to?
Right.
Is sort of implied. But actually, it's as simple as she's bringing girls to Epstein.
That's what the government alleged.
Right.
When she was convicted, that's what she was convicted of doing. Right. And people, but I've heard that question. It's a rhetorical question that people will indignantly ask. Yeah. Well, then what is Ghislaine Maxwell in prison for? As if you can't discover what she's in prison for. If it's not in the public record and the court transcripts or whatever, we know what she's in prison for. We know what she was convicted of. I think wrongfully convicted, but nonetheless convicted. Yeah, it was a sex trafficking conspiracy that consisted of 2 people.
You know what? We've covered so much ground.
Yes. We could do a part 2 or a part 3.
If you don't mind, we're going to do 10 minutes over on the Substack of quick fire debunks.
Let's do it.
Super quick fire. But we're going to do the weird paintings they found. Before we do that, is there anything
by the way, I don't even like the term debunking. I don't go around trumpeting myself as being a debunker. I know, but I just find it a little annoying. It reminds me of these very tedious media fact checking exercises where it's we're going to debunk every little joke that Donald Trump makes or something. And I don't know. Yeah.
I know that's frustrating. What you actually are is a thorough and conscientious journalist who hasn't
thank you so
fallen
much.
prey to a lot of bullshit.
Now, please kiss my ass.
Yeah. Before we do that, is there anything you'd like to bring attention to? Your work.
Oh, my work. Okay, yeah. mtracy.net, mtracey.net.
That's your Substack.
That's a Substack. Yeah. There's mtracy on YouTube. I don't put as much of a focus on YouTube because, frankly, despite the fact that I'm on podcasts constantly, I feel like I need to stick up for the written word at this point.
Yeah.
We can't be totally supplanted by podcasts 24/7, especially given the, let's say, suboptimal factual and journalistic standards that are often employed on these podcasts with, like, the Darryl Coopers of the world, et cetera. So, some podcasts are fine, but like, I just want to, my emphasis, I'm trying to remain like anchored in writing.
That's great.
And then YouTube is mtracy, Substack is mtracy.net, and then on X it's mtracy. So mtracy everywhere.
And keep an eye out. You publish articles and various.
And other I write for other publications as well. So,
well, thank you so much. Let's head over to the Substack.
Things that people are claiming they so confidently believe must be true and must be covered up are like fantastical.
Can you provide corrective for me on his death?
Okay, so the death is an interesting one. The Bureau of Prison staff, basically tampered with what had been a crime scene before it could be analyzed. Meaning they moved some of the cameras were not operational. There was one camera that was operational, but it has like an odd angle. And he had a cellmate for a while, this guy Nicholas Tartaglione. He was attacked.
Is there anything people need to keep an eye on next with regards to Epstein? What's on the horizon? What is insignificant? And
so there's a few things on the horizon, right?
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Michael Tracey. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now for an extended conversation between me and Michael, not only where he is going to debunk what happened around the death, this truth about Jeffrey Epstein's death, but also we're going to do some quick fire debunking of some of the other conspiracies surrounding the Jeffrey Epstein's case. That's all at winstonmarshall.co.uk. Remember to press subscribe here on YouTube, but otherwise, thank you, and until next time, be well.